It wasn't that Jonah wasn't used to having bits of formaldehyde-soaked, laboratory-approved pig intestine flipped at the back of his neck. No, that part wasn't so surprising. What bothered him more was the ever-present din, the never-ending stream of chatter, the constant giggles surrounding him. Jonah had been successfully ignoring the boys who cleverly used their scalpels and scissors to catapult their biology projects at him, but he was having a much more difficult time with the noise. While his classmates dutifully talked over the overworked, underpaid freshman biology teacher attempting to deliver dissection instructions, Jonah ignored him in a much subtler way. He had been thinking a lot lately about zombie stars, the pieces of post-supernova stars which float in a kind of undead state in the universe. Jonah was enchanted by the knowledge that these stellar corpses sometimes emitted high-energy X-rays, which NASA liked to call howls. His lab notebook had a few sketches of stars whom he'd given rotting, brain-hungry faces, making expressions to depict these howls. He had been so utterly lost in thoughts of life and death in the cosmos that he had completely drowned out his teacher's desperate attempts at instruction and the slimy substance on his neck. However, he was having to work extra hard to ignore the loud, constant, intrusive conversations of his peers. All of this meant that in all likelihood, Jonah would fail this project, as he had the last 3 biology projects, last 2 book reports, and recent math quiz. His parents would not be pleased. He was banking on his mother's preoccupation with nursery colors and hormonal meltdowns about car seat safety to divert attention away from his abysmal GPA. Jonah had taken to going straight from school to the planetarium those days. He liked the slow rotation of the simulated stars and the easy access to constellations on cloudy nights. He arrived, nodded a greeting to the woman at the front desk who had come to know him well, and made his way into the dome. Lying flat on his back, he began his escape, the place in his mind which hovered between concentration and haze. He was floating in a thought about rogue planets when he felt a buzz from his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone and picked up the call from his father. "Hey, Dad, I'm at the planetarium. What's up?" "She's coming," his dad said, sounding flustered. "Nina's coming. Jonah, we're going to be at the hospital for a while. We don't have time to come get you, but we'll see you soon. I'll call you. If you could find a way here, that'd be great." "Okay, son, we have to go," he said, all in one breath. Jonah heard a beep and his dad's voice was gone. He tucked his phone back into his pocket and returned to looking up at Pisces. He tried to get back into the lull he so often found here, but suddenly everything in his mind focused differently. He couldn't find comfort in the void. He couldn't even work himself up into a state of anxiety about the infinitely expanding universe and his minor meaningless place in it. Something must be wrong. "Going so soon?" the friendly front desk woman asked when Jonah left the dome just 15 minutes after entering. "Yeah, my mom's having a baby." The woman's face lit up with the kind of happiness only seen in women thinking about infants, a look Jonah had become accustomed to. "Well, that is a good reason to be hurrying out of here," she said, beaming her new baby smile. "I guess you're headed to the hospital then. Are you excited to meet your brother, sister?" "Sister. And no, I'm just going home." Jonah tugged at a piece of his hair and crossed his arms. "Oh, I see," the woman said. "Is this your parents' first one besides you?" She thought she saw a small nod from him and continued, "Well, she's going to be a pretty important change in your lives. I remember when I had my second son, my oldest was just miserable. For a couple weeks. It'll all settle down and you'll be a great older brother." She smiled warmly and waited for a response. Jonah murmured something which could have been "thank you" or "see you" and rushed through the exit doors. He made it only a few steps before his worrying brain stopped his feet and drew his face towards the sky. He couldn't help but wonder whether life forms in another galaxy worried about babies this much. It seemed silly to him, really, making such a big fuss. Nothing had changed, had it? It wasn't anywhere near as important as something like the Curiosity rover landing on Mars or all the Earth-like planets being discovered. But everyone was making such a big deal of it. It was just a baby. Jonah tapped the pad of his index finger lightly against the plastic fish, paying no attention to the ensuing rotation of the blue and red spool. Nina's eyes traced the movements of Jonah's hands and the gently swaying mobile. She let out a small gurgle, the kind babies make to remind you that they're just little humans with tiny digestive tracts and tiny feelings. He watched her, watching him, and felt the urge to join her in the crib, if only he could fit. He placed himself down on the floor by the crib's legs and lay flat on his back, watching the lethargy tragic rotation of the fish. His eyes drifted to the place halfway between focus and blur as he allowed the steady, bobbing, swaying movement serve its intended purpose. The powder blue wallpaper emerged in his vision with the still barely moving mobile, and he let the faux sky draw him in. Nina's piercing cry drew him back to fish and wallpaper and baby sister. He stood, scooped her up into his arms, and nestled her little form into the nook above his right hip bone. He gently bobbed and swayed, hoping it would calm her a little. His mother came into the room. "Well, thanks for getting her, Jonah. You're off the hook. She probably just needs to be fed," she said, making her way to the overstuffed navy rocking chair in the corner she liked to feed Nina in. Jonah stood still, eyes fixated on Nina's wailing face. "You can pass her over to me now," his mother said, reaching her hands out expectantly. He didn't move. "Do you want to nurse her yourself? Because if you figured out a way to do that, then be my guest." "She's hot." Jonah's voice quivered. "She feels really hot." His mother leapt up from the recliner and in 2 steps was across the room with her hand on Nina's forehead. "It's probably not a big deal," she said, though her face was concerned. "You had a couple fevers when you were a baby. Go get my cell phone and find Dr. Cardero's contact, Jonah," she said, deftly removing Nina from his arms. He stood for a second, hands still in their cradled position, eyes still tied to the chubby cheeks, emitting a sound too big for such a small body. He managed to tear his attention from his sister and stumbled out of the nursery, through the living room, and into the kitchen, where his mother's purse always sat in a chair at their breakfast table. He rifled through it, finally locating her phone lodged deep in the bottom between lipstick tubes and parking tickets. The phone rang slowly, what felt like minutes passing between each high-pitched tone. He scurried back to the nursery and passed his mother the still ringing phone. He listened to her tell the nurse receptionist her name, her doctor, what seemed to be the issue, then some moments of silence. "Dr. Cardero? Yeah, hi, it's Beth. My daughter Nina is very hot to the touch. 5 months. Yes, we just noticed it. Well, she won't stop crying, and it seems like she's getting louder. Yes, I can bring her in." Jonah, who had insisted on coming along, twisted his hair between his fingers and tapped his foot while the otoscope was inserted into Nina's ear. His mother had given up telling him to calm down and had moved her focus to Dr. Cardero, who was just beginning to share his diagnosis. "All right, it's what I expected. Nina has an ear infection, which is very common in children her age. The fever is just from her body trying to fight off the infection. It should clear up by itself within 2 or 3 days, so she will be in some pain and discomfort until then. It looks pretty mild, so I wouldn't worry too much." Jonah willed himself to be reassured by this information, but instead ended up unsettled by the idea of multiple days of infant suffering. His mother, on the other hand, took the information very well. She thanked the doctor and escorted her 2 children out of his office and through the sliding glass doors to the parking lot. The drive home consisted entirely of infant screams and teenage anxiety. Jonah lay on his back with his arms extended to the ceiling, Nina perched on his hand so that she was suspended in the air above him, her face filled with the kind of pure glee that can only come from newly cleared eustachian tubes. "Everything all right in here?" his mother asked, entering the nursery to check on Nina. Jonah looked at the disproportionately huge eyes staring down at him. "Do you ever think that maybe babies understand more than we think they do?" His mother glanced down at him questioningly. "All I mean is, do you ever look in Nina's eyes and see, well, I guess see like a real person? She seems like she's got a lot going on in there," he said. His mother took a moment to think and said, "Maybe you're right, but there's no way she's got as much going on in there as you, Jonah." He laid and stewed on this for a while. "I think you might be wrong," he said after a minute. "I think maybe the things we think are the most complicated sometimes aren't, and we underestimate the little things. Coming from the kid who told me all he wanted for his 6th birthday was a rocket ship and a map of Jupiter. Well, that's just it. Before, the biggest things were always the biggest things. But she's so tiny, and she's bigger than the whole universe." Jonah slid his scalpel through the brownish-yellow belly of the frog-pinned spread eagle on the tray in front of him. He peeled back the skin, followed by the muscle, to reveal gray, noodly innards, glancing at the instruction sheet to his left every so often. His lab partner, Elizabeth, stood squeamishly by, taking notes and writing down answers to the assigned lab questions. Does anybody remember what I said last time about the reason we dissect frogs in this class? Jonah's teacher asked from the front of the room, trying desperately to keep the attention of a room of armed adolescents, equally divided between the intrigued and the disgusted. Jonah did remember. Their organs are laid out a lot like ours, he said. His teacher and a few students cast surprised glances his way. And he continued, and they show us how evolution works with their tongues being all long and sticky for catching bugs. That's a really good answer, Jonah, thank you, his teacher said, genuinely relieved for a correct response. Jonah prodded at the stomach of the amphibian, then turned to Elizabeth. You know, when my mom was like 4 months pregnant, the doctor told me Muna was about the size of a frog. That's a really weird thing to compare to a baby. He smiled, remembering his own comparison of his sister to Moon Rock. Not so weird. Her arms and legs were all folded into her body like a frog's. She was probably pretty slimy too, he joked. Elizabeth laughed half-heartedly and continued answering loud questions. Jonah sliced into the tiny stomach and peeled it open. He saw the remnants of the frog's last meal, some amorphous blobs that could have been bugs or maybe a worm. Jonah felt a pang for the frog who probably worked so hard to live, only to die for a 14-year-old kid's biology lesson. He looked down and silently thanked the creature.